So, the United States just imposed the highest lumber tariffs on Canada in the history of the bilateral trade relationship. Not a modest increase, not a negotiating posture, not a temporary measure designed to bring Canada to the table. A 270% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber, the single largest tariff ever placed on a construction material by any G7 nation against any allied country. And within 72 hours, the American housing market began to collapse in ways that economists are calling entirely predictable, entirely preventable, and entirely self-inflicted. Canada's response wasn't to negotiate. It wasn't to absorb the cost, it wasn't to plead for relief or offer concessions or quietly wait for the tariff to be walked back. Mark Carney announced the immediate redirection of Canadian lumber exports to the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and 16 additional nations, locking in long-term supply contracts that guarantee those markets priority access to Canadian softwood for the next decade. Canada simultaneously suspended all lumber exports to the United States, effective immediately, not reduced, not throttled, suspended entirely. The country that supplies 47% of all lumber used in American home building just stopped selling it to America. Warren Buffett called it the most predictable economic disaster in modern American history, and then explained the principle that every first-year economics student learns, and that the White House apparently skipped: you do not impose tariffs on things you cannot replace, because the tariff doesn't punish the supplier, it punishes the buyer. But here's what will define this chapter. The 7 words Carney said on camera that are now being quoted by every housing economist, every construction executive, and every American family that just watched the cost of buying a home jump by $60,000 overnight. When you hear the full scale of America's lumber dependency, what Carney's redirection means for every house being built in the United States right now, and what Buffett says this will cost the average American family over the next decade, you'll understand why this isn't a trade dispute. This is the moment the American dream of homeownership became unaffordable, not because of market forces, not because of interest rates, not because of supply and demand, but because the White House declared a trade war on the country that builds America's houses. Hit subscribe because the housing numbers coming out next month will shock the country, and we'll be covering every one of them. Let me take you through exactly what happened, because the specifics reveal something about American vulnerability that most Americans have never considered, and that the White House either didn't know or chose to ignore. The tariff was announced by executive order on a Tuesday morning without congressional consultation, without an impact assessment from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and without any apparent awareness of the supply chain reality that would turn the announcement into a catastrophe. The order imposed a 270% duty on all Canadian softwood lumber imports, a category that includes the framing lumber, structural timber, plywood, and engineered wood products that constitute the skeleton of virtually every home, apartment building, school, hospital, and commercial structure built in the United States. The stated rationale was that Canadian lumber producers receive unfair government subsidies through below-market timber pricing on Crown lands, and that American lumber producers deserve protection from what the order called predatory Canadian pricing practices. The language of the executive order was revealing. American lumber producers deserve a level playing field, as though the purpose of trade policy is to protect producers, rather than to serve the Americans who need affordable building materials to put roofs over their families' heads. Predatory Canadian pricing practices, as though selling lumber at competitive prices to a willing buyer is predatory, as though Canada is attacking American consumers by offering them affordable wood. This tariff will revitalize the American timber industry and create thousands of jobs, as though you can revitalize an industry that produces 30% of what the country needs by cutting off the country that produces the other 47%. The math was never going to work. It was never designed to work. It was designed to sound strong, to project toughness, and to deliver a headline that could be claimed as a victory in the trade war, regardless of what it would cost every American trying to buy a home, rent an apartment, or build anything out of wood. Behind the scenes, the decision had been opposed by virtually every economic advisor with access to the data. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development had submitted a memo, leaked within days, warning that a tariff above 50% would trigger an immediate and severe disruption in the American residential construction market, and that a tariff at the proposed level would effectively halt new single-family home construction in the majority of American markets for a period of 6 to 18 months. The National Association of Home Builders had requested an emergency meeting with the White House trade team, which was denied. The Council of Economic Advisors had modeled the impact and concluded that the tariff would add between $45,000 and $70,000 to the cost of a new single-family home and between $15,000 and $25,000 to the cost of a new apartment unit. Every expert who saw the numbers said the same thing. Every warning was ignored. The tariff was imposed anyway. The supply chain reality is brutal, and it is simple. The United States consumes approximately 50 billion board feet of lumber annually. American forests and mills produce approximately 27 billion board feet, 53% of domestic demand. Canada supplies approximately 23 billion board feet, 47% of domestic demand. That 47% cannot be replaced by American production because the trees do not exist. American commercial forest land has been declining for decades due to development, conservation, and harvesting constraints. The timber that does exist takes 20 to 30 years to reach harvestable maturity. The mills that would need to process additional volume do not exist and would require billions in capital investment and 5 to 7 years to build. The workforce to operate those mills does not exist and would need to be recruited and trained in regions where labor markets are already tight. The 47% gap between what America produces and what America needs is not a policy choice, it is a biological and industrial fact. And a tariff does not change biology. At 270%, the tariff effectively priced Canadian lumber out of the American market, which was the stated intention. But the unstated consequence, the consequence that every economist warned about and every housing expert predicted, was that the lumber didn't just become expensive, it became unavailable. Because Canada didn't sit and wait for America to come back to the table at a higher price. Canada found other buyers immediately, permanently. The global lumber market had been undersupplied for years. European construction was booming. Japan's post-earthquake rebuilding programs needed timber. South Korea's housing expansion required softwood framing. Australia's construction sector had been competing with American buyers for Canadian supply for a decade. The moment the tariff made the American market hostile, Canada redirected, and the buyers who received that redirected supply signed long-term contracts specifically designed to prevent Canada from rerouting back to the United States when the tariff was eventually lifted. And then Carney responded, and his response wasn't just a redirection. It was the most surgically precise economic counterstrike of the entire trade conflict, because it targeted not an industry, not a sector, but a dream. The American dream. The dream of homeownership that sits at the center of American identity, American aspiration, and American politics. Carney understood something that the White House either didn't see or didn't care about. Lumber isn't steel. It isn't aluminum. It isn't a commodity that affects industrial production in ways that most voters never notice. Lumber is the thing that houses are made of. Every American who has ever built a home, bought a home, renovated a home, or dreamed of owning a home understands lumber. And every one of those Americans was about to learn exactly how much of their lumber came from Canada and exactly how much more they would now pay because their president decided to start a trade war with the country that supplied it. Carney's announcement was made in the House of Commons with the full cabinet present and the Canadian lumber industry's leadership watching from the gallery. He laid out 3 measures that together constituted the most consequential redirection of a natural resource in the history of the bilateral relationship. First, the immediate and complete suspension of all softwood lumber exports to the United States effective in 72 hours, with no exceptions for contracts already in progress. Second, the signing of long-term preferential supply agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and 16 additional nations, guaranteeing those markets priority access to Canadian softwood for a minimum of 10 years at prices significantly below what American buyers had been paying. Third, a $4 billion federal investment in Canadian lumber processing capacity, new mills, new kiln drying facilities, new engineered wood product plants designed to increase the value-added component of Canadian lumber exports and reduce Canada's dependence on raw commodity sales to a single market. Then the 7 words. Carney looked into the camera with a quiet composure that had become his signature in these moments and spoke directly to the American home buyer, not to the president, not to the trade negotiators, not to Congress, but to the families. I want to address this to every American family that is building a home, saving for a home, or dreaming of owning a home. Your president just made your house more expensive, not because of market conditions, not because of interest rates, not because of supply and demand, because he decided to declare a trade war on the country that provides nearly half the wood your homes are built with. That decision was made without asking you. The cost of that decision will be paid by you. He paused. Canada did not start this. Canada did not impose this tariff. Canada did not choose to make American homes more expensive. That choice was made in Washington by people who will never feel the cost of it, and it will be paid by every young family in America trying to build a life. Another pause. Then, directly into the camera, 7 words that landed like a mortgage payment. You don't tariff what you can't build without. The phrase was trending within 5 minutes. Within an hour, it was the headline on the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNBC, Reuters, and the front page of every major housing industry publication in North America. The National Association of Home Builders quoted it in their emergency statement. The National Association of Realtors used it as the subject line of their member alert. Housing economists called it the 7 words that explained the crisis better than 1,000 pages of analysis. Now let me explain why this is different from every other tariff in this trade conflict. Because the distinction matters, and it explains why the consequences are arriving faster, hitting harder, and spreading wider than anything that has come before. Every previous tariff in the U.S.-Canada confrontation targeted industries. Steel tariffs hit manufacturers. Energy tariffs hit refineries and utilities. Agricultural tariffs hit producers and exporters. Those industries absorbed the costs, adjusted their supply chains, and passed some of the impact to consumers in ways that were real but diffuse. A few cents on a can of food, a few dollars on a car, a marginal increase in an electricity bill. The costs were spread across millions of transactions and millions of consumers in amounts that were individually survivable, even if collectively enormous. Lumber is different. Lumber tariffs don't hit an industry. They hit a home. A specific, tangible, emotionally charged, financially defining purchase that most American families will make once or twice in their lives. The cost increase is not diffuse. It is concentrated. It is not a few cents on a product. It is $45,000 to $70,000 on a house. It is the difference between qualifying for a mortgage and not qualifying, between affording a home in the community where your children go to school and being priced out of it, between building wealth through homeownership, the primary mechanism by which the American middle class has accumulated wealth for 3 generations, and being locked out of that mechanism entirely. This tariff does not attack a supply chain. It attacks a life plan. A Georgetown housing economist put it in terms that cut through every political abstraction. There are approximately 6 million American families actively in the process of buying or building a home. As of this week, every single one of them will pay more. Not a little more, dramatically more. The families at the margins, the first-time buyers stretching to qualify, the young couples saving for a down payment, the families in rural communities where construction costs were already tight, those families just had the door closed on them, not by the market, not by interest rates, by a policy decision that every housing expert in the country warned against. A Harvard professor of urban planning said, "Home ownership is the American dream. This tariff is a tax on the American dream, and it is being paid not by the wealthy, who already own their homes, but by the young, the working class, and the middle class, who are still trying to achieve it." And here's the paradox that the White House apparently never calculated. The paradox that makes this tariff not just economically destructive but politically catastrophic. The stated purpose of the tariff was to protect American lumber producers, and it will, temporarily, by eliminating their Canadian competition. American lumber prices will rise, American lumber companies will see increased revenue, American timber workers in Oregon, Washington, Georgia, and the Carolinas will benefit in the short term. But the Americans who are harmed by the tariff outnumber the Americans who benefit by a ratio that is almost comically lopsided. The American lumber industry employs approximately 500,000 workers. The American housing industry, including construction, real estate, mortgage lending, home improvement, and all related services, employs over 12 million workers and affects the financial lives of the approximately 130 million Americans who own homes and the 50 million who are trying to. The White House protected 500,000 workers by imposing costs on 180 million. It shielded an industry that produces 27 billion board feet of lumber by cutting off the 23 billion board feet that the country still needs and cannot produce. It boosted the revenue of lumber companies by destroying the affordability of the product that lumber companies exist to supply. And the families who bear the cost, the families paying $60,000 more for a home, are not concentrated in distant states or abstract economic sectors. They are in every congressional district, in every zip code, in every community where a house is being built, a mortgage is being applied for, a life is being planned. They vote, they write letters to their representatives, and they will remember who made their house unaffordable. Warren Buffett's response cut through the noise with a clarity that only comes from someone who has spent 7 decades understanding the relationship between commodities, markets, and the decisions that destroy both. He didn't talk about trade policy in the abstract. He talked about wood, about houses, about the specific mechanical, unavoidable reality of what happens when you impose a 270% tariff on a material that you need far more than the supplier needs to sell it to you. In 70 years of investing, Buffett said, "I have learned one rule about tariffs that most politicians never learn, because they have never run a business that depends on supply chains. The rule is this: a tariff on something you can replace is a negotiating tool. A tariff on something you cannot replace is a tax on yourself. That's it. That's the whole analysis." If you can source the product from somewhere else, from domestic producers, from alternative suppliers, from substitute materials, then the tariff pressures the target to lower prices or lose market share. That's how tariffs are supposed to work. But if you cannot replace the product, the tariff doesn't pressure the target at all, it pressures your own consumers. Because they still need the product, they have nowhere else to get it, and now they have to pay the tariff on top of the price. The United States cannot replace Canadian lumber. The trees do not exist, the mills do not exist, the workforce does not exist. The 23 billion board feet that Canada was supplying cannot be conjured from domestic sources because domestic sources are already producing everything they can. This tariff does not pressure Canada. Canada has already found other buyers. This tariff is a tax on every American who needs wood, which is every American who lives in a house. He applied the analysis to housing with the precision of someone whose companies build, insure, and finance homes across America. I know something about the cost of building a house. Berkshire owns companies that manufacture building materials, that sell building materials, and that insure the homes that are built with those materials. When the cost of lumber increases by the amount this tariff imposes, the cost of a new home doesn't increase by a proportional amount. It increases by a multiplied amount. Because lumber isn't just a material, it is a bottleneck. Construction crews cannot frame a house without lumber. They cannot sheathe it, roof it, or finish it. They stand idle. And idle construction crews cost money. Equipment leases, insurance, labor contracts that accumulates every day the lumber doesn't arrive. A $60,000 increase in material costs becomes an $80,000 increase in total construction costs when you account for the delays, the idle labor, and the cascading inefficiencies. And an $80,000 increase in the cost of a home means approximately 400,000 fewer American families will qualify for a mortgage this year. Those are not statistics, those are families, and those families just had the door closed on them. Buffett went deeper into the structural damage that the tariff would inflict on the American economy beyond housing itself. Most people understand that expensive lumber means expensive houses. What most people don't understand is that housing is the single largest driver of the American domestic economy. A new home generates approximately $90,000 in secondary economic activity: appliances, furniture, landscaping, insurance, property taxes, local services. When new housing starts to decline, that secondary activity declines with it. When housing starts to decline by the amount that the industry is now projecting, a drop of 25 to 40% over the next 12 months, the secondary economic contraction will be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Retailers who sell to homeowners will see revenue drop. Manufacturers of appliances and fixtures will cut production. Local governments that depend on property tax revenue from new construction will face budget shortfalls. The housing market is not a sector of the economy. It is the foundation of the economy, and this tariff just cracked the foundation. The Berkshire parallel landed with quiet devastation. I've watched companies impose procurement policies that were designed to punish a supplier and that ended up destroying their own production capacity. A company decides it doesn't want to pay its supplier's prices, so it cuts the supplier off, confident that alternatives exist. The alternatives don't exist. Or they exist at twice the cost. Or they exist but can't deliver at the volume needed. And the company, which thought it was exercising leverage, discovers that it was exercising self-destruction. The supplier finds new customers. The company finds itself unable to make its own product. The executive who authorized the decision is always the last person to understand what happened, because the people who warned him were the people he stopped listening to. He paused. That is what just happened to the American housing market. The supplier found new customers, and 180 million Americans just discovered that their homes are made of Canadian wood. Buffett's closing was devastating in its arithmetic simplicity. Let me give you one number that tells you everything about this tariff. The American lumber industry that this tariff protects generates approximately $32 billion in annual revenue. The American housing market that this tariff damages generates approximately $2.3 trillion in annual activity. You are protecting $32 billion by jeopardizing $2.3 trillion. That is not a trade strategy, that is a math error. And the American families who pay for that error will be paying for it with 30-year mortgages on houses that just became $60,000 more expensive, which means they will be paying for this tariff long after the president who imposed it is no longer in office, and long after the trade war it was supposed to win has been forgotten by everyone except the families still writing checks. And then the consequences arrived. Not slowly, not in the abstract, not in the way that most trade disruptions arrive, as data points in economic reports that most Americans never read. The consequences arrived in the form of concrete foundations sitting empty, because framing lumber was unavailable, of construction cranes standing idle over half-finished apartment buildings, of price increase notices sent to families who had already signed contracts for new homes, of mortgage applications denied because the appraised value of the home no longer justified the loan. The National Association of Home Builders reported that new housing starts dropped 31% in the first month following the tariff. 31% in 1 month, the sharpest single-month decline since the 2008 financial crisis, caused not by a banking collapse, not by a recession, not by a pandemic, but by a tariff. The regional impacts were devastating, and they fell hardest on the communities that could least afford them. In the Sun Belt, Texas, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Arizona, where population growth had been driving the strongest residential construction boom in a generation, housing starts collapsed by 35 to 42%. Builders who had committed to developments based on pre-tariff lumber costs faced a choice between absorbing losses that would bankrupt their companies or passing the costs to buyers who could no longer afford them. In rural America, where housing costs were already rising faster than incomes, the tariff made new construction effectively impossible at price points that local families could afford. The mayor of a small town in Tennessee that had been experiencing its first construction boom in 20 years said, "We had 6 homes being built in our community." 6. That doesn't sound like a lot to someone in a big city, but for us it was everything. New families, new tax revenue, new life in a town that was dying. 3 of those builds are now on hold. The other 3 are going to cost 20% more than the families who ordered them can pay. This tariff didn't protect my town. It killed the best thing that has happened to my town in a generation. The rental market was hit simultaneously and from the same cause. Apartment construction, which uses the same Canadian softwood for framing, sheathing, and structural components, saw cost increases that developers immediately passed to tenants. Average rents in new construction jumped between 8 and 14% in the first quarter following the tariff. In markets where rental affordability was already at crisis levels, New York, San Francisco, Denver, Austin, Seattle, Miami, the increase pushed thousands of families past the 30% of income threshold that economists define as housing burdened. One real estate analyst summarized it with precision that was immediately quoted across the industry. "This tariff is the most regressive tax in America right now. It is paid entirely by people who need housing. It is not paid by people who already own housing. It is not paid by the wealthy. It is paid by the young, the working class, and the middle class. It is paid by renters whose landlords just raised their rent. It is paid by first-time buyers whose dream just got $60,000 further away. And it is paid every month in every mortgage check and every rent check for 30 years. The international dimension was the element that the White House had entirely failed to model and that made the consequences permanent rather than temporary. Canada's redirection of lumber exports was not a retaliatory gesture. It was a structural realignment that the global market had been waiting for. European builders had been competing with American buyers for Canadian supply for years, consistently outbid because American demand and American proximity gave U.S. importers a natural advantage. The tariff eliminated that advantage overnight. European buyers didn't just absorb the redirected supply, they locked it in. The 10-year preferential supply agreements that Carney signed included price guarantees, volume commitments, and exclusivity clauses designed to ensure that Canadian lumber would not flow back to American markets even if the tariff were lifted. Japan signed a 7-year supply agreement. South Korea signed for 8 years. Australia committed to a 12-year partnership that included joint investment in Canadian processing capacity. The message from every one of these agreements was identical. We will take what America just rejected, and we will make sure America cannot take it back. American domestic politics fractured along the line that this tariff drew, the line between the small number of Americans who benefit from it and the enormous number who are harmed by it. Republican representatives from lumber-producing districts in the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast defended the tariff as necessary to protect American jobs. Republican representatives from every other district watched their constituents face housing cost increases that they could not explain, defend, or mitigate. 12 Republican members of Congress sent a joint letter to the White House requesting an emergency review of the tariff's impact on housing affordability. 3 Republican senators from Sunbelt states publicly called for a reduction. The Republican governor of Texas, the state with the highest volume of residential construction in the nation, held a press conference at a stalled construction site in suburban Dallas and said, "I support protecting American industry. I do not support making it impossible for Texas families to build homes. This tariff needs to be revised, and it needs to be revised now before the damage becomes irreversible." The governor of Florida was more direct. "My state is growing by 1,000 people a day. Those people need houses. This tariff just made those houses unaffordable. I need the White House to explain to me how that serves Florida. American polling showed a public that understood the connection between the tariff and their own financial reality with a clarity that surprised both parties. 64% of Americans opposed the lumber tariff within 2 weeks of its implementation, the highest opposition for any single trade measure in the conflict. 71% said they were concerned or very concerned about the tariff's impact on housing costs. Among Americans aged 25 to 40, the demographic most actively trying to buy their first home, opposition reached 79%. The most devastating number for the White House was among homeowners, a demographic that typically supports trade protections. 52% of existing homeowners opposed the tariff, with the most commonly cited reason being concern about rising construction and renovation costs. The tariff had managed to unite renters, buyers, builders, and existing homeowners in opposition, a political achievement of remarkable negative breadth. So here's where we stand. The United States imposed a 270% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber, the material that constitutes the structural skeleton of nearly every home built in America. Canada responded by suspending all lumber exports to the United States and redirecting its entire supply to European and Asian markets under long-term contracts designed to make the redirection permanent. New housing starts in America dropped 31% in a single month. The cost of a new home increased by $60,000. Approximately 400,000 American families lost their ability to qualify for a mortgage. And Warren Buffett explained why with the devastating simplicity of a man who has spent 7 decades understanding what happens when you tax yourself. You don't impose tariffs on things you can't replace, because the tariff doesn't punish the supplier, it punishes the buyer. Carney stood in the House of Commons and said 7 words that are now quoted in every housing report, every construction industry briefing, and every mortgage application denial letter being read by American families this month. You don't tariff what you can't build without. Buffett said it with different words but arrived at the same conclusion. Protecting a $32 billion industry by jeopardizing a $2.3 trillion market is not a trade strategy, it is a math error, and the families who pay for that error will be paying for it with 30-year mortgages on homes that just became permanently more expensive. Can the American housing market recover when its primary source of lumber has been redirected to other buyers under decade-long contracts? Can the $2.3 trillion housing economy absorb a 31% decline in construction starts without triggering a broader recession? Can the political coalition that imposed this tariff survive when the families it hurts outnumber the workers it protects by a ratio of 360 to 1? And the question that every young American family trying to buy a home is asking right now, if the American dream of homeownership is being priced out of reach not by the market but by a policy decision made in Washington, who exactly is this economy for? Trump imposed the tariff to protect American lumber. Instead, he destroyed American housing. He tried to punish Canada for selling wood at competitive prices. Instead, he punished every American family trying to build a life. He tried to show that American economic power could force Canada to accept unfavorable terms. Instead, he showed that American homes are built with Canadian wood and that there is no alternative, no substitute, and no executive order that can grow a tree in 5 years that takes 30. And he gave Mark Carney the 7 words that every American family now understands in the most personal way possible, 7 words they will feel every month in every mortgage check for the next 30 years. You don't tariff what you can't build without.